Hey guys, welcome back to Flashbacks. I'm Tony from CBFU, and before we get started with this episode, I want to take a second and apologize for being behind on this series. Between my birthday and filming and editing the main CBFU podcast to make sure those get out on time, I lost track of time with this one. I'm going to make up for it though right now by recording a Flashbacks for episodes 10 through 14, essentially catching up to the show since it's going on hiatus for about a month. So with that out of the way, let's get started with episode 10, Revenge of the Rogues. What's special about this episode for me is that it introduces another member of the Flash Rogues Gallery, Mick Rory, better known as Heatwave. Now I've talked about him in previous episodes, so I'm not going to go too much into him, but essentially Heatwave is the polar opposite of Captain Cold. His main weapon is a flamethrower. What's also interesting to note about this character, where in the comics, his history is that he was first originally a member of the Rogues, and he and Captain Cold essentially were partners, but they never quite got along, to the point where eventually he leaves the Rogues and tries to go on a life of straight and narrow, starts working for the feds, but ultimately kind of gets called back into the life of being a rogue, mostly because his obsession with fire, being a pyromaniac. This episode does a really good job of highlighting all his weird quirks. They did go a little over the top with the performance for his character, to the point where I feel like they kind of had to force in a joke towards the end where saying that he's a bit of a hothead. But overall, I think he really works, and I think his chemistry with Captain Cold really comes through, especially since they shared so much time on a previous show of Prison Break. An aspect of the CW Flash series that I really love is that it's been taking its time to establish certain characters before they're even introduced on camera. They did it with Heatwave, and they did it again in this episode with Hartley Rathaway, where we get to meet his parents. You understand that he comes from a wealthy background. They give a hint that his relationship with his parents is very strained. So, whereas I'll go more into the character himself in the next episode, I just wanted to take a second and point out that I really liked that they put the groundwork in early, so we didn't have to have an entire episode dedicated to his background. There's a nice little Easter egg in this episode where Iris gives Barry his old backpack from when he was a little kid, and in his bag he has his old comics, and the only comic you see him pull out is a copy of Space Ghost. Space Ghost is actually a comic published by DC, and it's interesting to note that this essentially means that DC Comics exists in this world. Now that may sound a little too meta, like too much of an in-joke, but it's not something that's foreign from the comics. DC Comics exists within the DC universe. It's interesting to note that it's not used too often, but when it is, it's used in stories like Superboy Prime, where he at one point is reading a story about, his exploits and complaining how so many people hate him. So yeah, it's just a nice little Easter egg. You're not really supposed to think too much of it, but I thought it was a cool thing to put in the episode. Now, while watching this episode, there were a few people that had actually asked in a discussion that we had going on our CBFU group page. And one of the questions came up was, is Firestorm really an acronym in the comics? And quite honestly, I think that was just created for the show. That has I can't prove it, but it has a very Jeff Johns kind of vibe to it, where he has this ability to look at characters and try to find some sort of inspiration to give them a further backstory. So by using Firestorm, the word, and bringing it down into an acronym, that felt very much in John's wheelhouse. So I just wanted to point that out. Continuing on with Firestorm, we actually get introduced to Jason Rush in this episode, which I wasn't really expecting. Jason Rush being one half of another iteration of Firestorm, first with his girlfriend and then later on with Ronnie Raymond, and currently in the story Future's End with yet another new character. Jason Rush is a very important character to the overall history of Firestorm, but I like that, again, they introduce a character well before we're ever going to probably ever see them in any kind of superhero scenarios, and it's just a great universe building tool to do stuff like that. Keeping with the theme of naming side streets after writers or artists, this episode introduces a street named after Howard Porter, who worked on The Flash with Jeff Johns towards the end of his Wally West run. This isn't so much of an Easter egg, but at one point Captain Cold refers to The Flash as the Scarlet Speedster, It's just a nickname he's had since, he debuted in the Silver Age. It's another thing to call the Flash besides, the Flash or Barry Allen or the Fastest Man Alive, and I'm glad it worked its way into the show. So something that doesn't quite get explained a lot in the comics or in TV shows or in films is when a character's weapons or costumes get destroyed, how do they keep finding new versions of them? In this particular episode, in this particular subject matter, I just want to take a second to talk about Captain Cold's Cold Gun and Heatwave's flamethrower. They get confiscated by the police when they get arrested at the end of the episode, but at one point earlier in the episode, Rory mentions to Snart how he had to rebuild the gun or learn how to fix the gun at all times. So it's not hard to figure out that these two have a good understanding of how these weapons work and what the components are to build them. So if, say, they can't get the guns that they were using in this episode, they could theoretically rebuild them given the right elements and parts that they would need to find later on down the line. Well, it only took 10 episodes, but now the Flash is a public figure in Central City. And I feel like this is something to be noted because when you look at how the Arrow was built up in Arrow, he's essentially just a vigilante on the street. He then gets the name the Hood, and then he gets the name the Arrow. No, when Flash becomes a public figure and people know who he is and people start talking about him, they start calling him the Flash. The only time he's ever referred to as a Streak was on Iris's blog, and I'm glad that they got the name out of the way so that way when he does become public, people just start calling him the Flash. And we need more of that. And I'm really liking the fact that he's seen as a hero to this city, as opposed to a vigilante, the way Ollie is seen in Starling. Lastly, this episode closes with the breakout of Leonard Snart and Mick Rory from their transport vehicle by an unseen character who we know is going to be Leonard Snart's sister, Lisa Snart, better known as the Goldwater. Now, I want to point out that I think I mentioned this in a previous episode, but if I forgot to, he talks about going to a diner with his sister in his first episode. So by the time we get to hear him talk to her off camera in this episode, we already know that they've been close. Now we have this idea that they've probably worked on jobs before, that she's also a criminal, she's experienced to do stuff like as complicated as breaking out people from a transport vehicle. So when we finally get to see her, whatever episode she debuts in, we'll already have a good idea of what she's capable of. Alright guys, that about wraps it up for this episode of Flashbacks. Again, I'm so sorry for the delay, but if I missed anything in this particular one, please sound up in the comments below, leave a like on this video, subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends, and since we got a month to wait for more episodes of The Flash, go back and rewatch the show on Hulu from episode 1. It's a fantastic show. It's my favorite show on TV right now. Alright guys, I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.